I am Arthur Sterling, 68 years old, and somehow I am still struggling to process the betrayal inflicted on me by my own flesh and blood. As the founder of a multinational aerospace and defense contracting empire, I gave them everything, but I always held my ground when it came to my bottom line. Last month, on the 5-year anniversary of my late wife's passing, I called my son to grab a simple dinner. He claimed he was drowning in Pentagon contract work and couldn't possibly get away. Later that evening, inside Virginia's most exclusive private country club, I was sipping an aged bourbon alone when I spotted him across the lavish dining room. He was laughing, clinking champagne glasses with his wife and his father-in-law. They thought I was just a clueless old man waiting to die. I simply walked over, right up to their table, and snapped his premium corporate credit card perfectly in half in front of everyone. That night, I logged into my encrypted servers, locked down my core assets, and set a plan in motion that will ultimately leave them with $20 million in highly toxic, radioactive federal debt. Before I get further into this story, let me know in the comments where you found this video. If you've ever had to stand up to greedy family members who underestimated your worth, please hit that like button and subscribe. The ringing of the phone echoed in my quiet, empty executive office. It was 6 o'clock on a Tuesday night. This wasn't just any regular Tuesday. It was the 5-year anniversary of losing my wife. I sat behind the heavy walnut desk at Sterling Defense Group, looking out over the city skyline on the edge of Washington, D.C., a corporate empire I had spent 40 years helping to build. I picked up the receiver and dialed my son, Julian. He was 34, my vice president of acquisitions, and truly the only family I had left in this world. The phone rang 3 times before he finally answered. I could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling in the background, the kind of noise someone makes when they are trying a little too hard to sound incredibly busy. I purposely kept my voice light and told him that I knew it was late, but I thought maybe we could head down to that old steakhouse in Georgetown. I suggested we grab a ribeye, maybe open a decent bottle of scotch, since it was, after all, that specific day. A heavy, exaggerated sigh came through the receiver. It was the kind of sigh a teenager lets out when asked to clean their room, not the attitude a grown man should have when speaking to his father. Julian told me he was really sorry, his voice dripping with a manufactured, industrial kind of exhaustion. He claimed things were absolutely insane on his end. According to him, the Defense Logistics Agency had just kicked back the zoning permits for the new Nevada test site. He said he was going to be chained to his desk, looking over blueprints and legal documents until midnight, and there was just no way he could leave the office. I leaned back in my leather chair. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, the kind of silent disappointment only a parent can truly understand. But at the same time, I felt a misguided sense of pride. I built this aerospace empire from a pile of scrap metal with my bare hands. Back in the 80s, I spent 3 years sleeping in the cab of a rusted pickup truck, eating cold-baked beans out of a can, welding metal in hangars by day, and studying federal defense procurement laws by flashlight at night. I built Sterling Defense Group so my son would never have to know what hunger felt like. If he was working late to protect our family's lifeblood, I couldn't blame him. I swallowed my disappointment and calmly told him that I understood. I said business always comes first, that we needed to keep those permits moving, and told him not to burn himself out so we could get together next week. Julian thanked me, called me the best dad in the world, promised to make it up to me, and told me to get some rest before hanging up. I sat in the silence of my office for a long time. 68 is a strange point in life. You'd think you would be surrounded by the loud, chaotic noise of family, as proof that your life meant something. Instead, all I had was the hum of the air conditioning and the distant wail of sirens on the streets below. I decided right then that I absolutely refused to eat a frozen dinner on a day like today. I put on my coat, took the private elevator down to the underground garage, and got into my sedan. As I drove through the bustling downtown streets, my mind drifted to Julian's childhood. I remembered missing his Little League games because I was busy negotiating loans with Wall Street bankers just to keep the lights on at the company. I remembered the gnawing guilt that ate at me every single time I had to leave him for a business trip. I overcompensated. I know that now. I gave him brand new luxury sports cars, a debt-free Ivy League education, and a vice president title at my company the second he graduated. I wanted to be a generous father, the kind of man who could provide a seamless, frictionless life. I thought I was protecting him. Instead, I completely insulated him from the real world. I robbed him of the hardships required to build character. And the result was a 34-year-old man who could effortlessly lie to his father on such an important day. When I arrived at the elite private country club in Virginia, the valet took my keys with a respectful nod. This was a place where everyone knew my name. It was a place where I had closed multi-million-dollar defense contracts through the dry smoke of expensive cigars. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped into the warm, dimly lit dining room. The aroma of roasted garlic, seared meats, and expensive red wine filled the air. Soft jazz flowed through the speakers, blending perfectly with the low murmurs of wealthy patrons enjoying their evening. The maitre d' approached me immediately with a warm, professional smile, greeting me and asking if I was joining my family. I frowned and stopped in my tracks, repeating the word family in confusion. He smiled, pointed toward the back of the restaurant, and told me my son had arrived with his guests about 30 minutes ago. He mentioned they had seated them in the center VIP booth, exactly as Julian had requested. A bony chilling cold swept through my entire body. It wasn't the chill of the night air. It was the absolute temperature drop you feel when your reality shatters in an instant. I didn't ask the maitre d' to lead the way. I just nodded and walked slowly through the dining room. Every step felt heavier than the last. I dodged waiters carrying silver platters and completely ignored the tables full of laughing couples. As I neared the center of the room, I heard it, a loud booming laugh. It was Julian. I stopped behind a massive decorative pillar and looked into the VIP booth. My son wasn't drowning in Department of Defense permits. He wasn't staring at any blueprints. He was sitting in a plush leather booth, wearing a perfectly tailored custom suit, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in months. Sitting right next to him was his wife, Chloe. She was leaning against his shoulder, holding a crystal flute filled with vintage champagne, and sitting across from them, commanding the attention of the entire table, was Richard. Chloe's father was an arrogant former state senator who always carried the condescending air of old money, even though his political career had been destroyed by a corruption scandal years ago. They were feasting. 3 massive seafood towers sat in the center of the table, piled high with fresh oysters, lobster tails, and king crab. 2 open bottles of champagne were chilling in silver ice buckets nearby. I watched as Richard meticulously picked a lobster claw completely clean. I never liked Richard. From the moment Julian and Chloe got married, Richard treated my wealth like his own personal winning lottery ticket. He was constantly making passive-aggressive remarks, hinting that I kept too tight a grip on my assets, or suggesting that a good father would buy his son a bigger estate or fund his father-in-law's political research trips to Europe. I always chose to ignore him, giving up the fight on petty things just to keep the peace in the family. But seeing him sitting there, laughing with a mouthful of food, made my blood boil. Chloe was also showing a side of herself I had never seen. In front of me, she played the part of the modest, respectful daughter-in-law. Now, leaning against Julian, her eyes were sharp, calculating, and full of absolute disdain. I stood in the shadows, completely stunned by the sheer audacity of the lie. My son had looked at his phone, saw it was his father calling on a deeply lonely day, and chose to spit out a mouthful of lies just so he could drink champagne with his father-in-law. I heard Richard's loud, politician-like voice cut right through the jazz music. He told Julian he was too good to them, praising the incredible restaurant for a Tuesday night, saying it was nothing but the best for his daughter. Julian smoothly replied that they deserved it, raising his glass to toast them. He claimed they needed a break because things at the office were just too exhausting. Chloe giggled, took a sip of her drink, and asked Julian if he was sure his dad wouldn't notice he snuck out. She made a snide comment about how paranoid I was about my precious schedules. I held my breath, waiting for my son to defend me. I waited for him to show even a single ounce of respect for the man who paid for the suit on his back and the roof over his head. Julian just let out a mocking sneer and rolled his eyes. He told them I was just a clueless old fool. He said my head was so full of golf swings and retirement plans that I had no idea what was going on right outside my own office door. He bragged about how I swallowed the excuse about the test site permits without a second thought, claiming I was completely out of touch. The three of them erupted into fits of laughter. It was a cruel, mocking sound that hit me harder than a physical blow ever could. In that moment, the sadness vanished. The hollow feeling in my chest disappeared, instantly replaced by a burning, razor-sharp clarity. I spent 40 years dealing with Wall Street predators, DoD bureaucrats, and hostile takeover artists. I knew exactly what a predator looked like, but I never expected to find three of them sitting at a dinner table, sucking up my money while laughing in my face. I didn't turn around and leave. I didn't go home to cry. I stepped out from behind the pillar and walked straight toward their table. The soft jazz kept playing, but the only thing I could hear was the rhythm of my own footsteps clicking against the hardwood floor. They were about to learn that this clueless old fool was the exact same man who personally built the golden cage they were currently sitting in. I took my first step out of the shadows. The gentle music hiding in the steakhouse speakers seemed to fade into the background, completely replaced by the steady, rhythmic sound of my leather shoes hitting the polished wood. I didn't rush. A man who has spent 4 decades navigating the dangerous waters of aerospace and defense. Contracting knows the value of controlling the pace. You never run toward a crisis. You walk toward it, owning every single inch of space you occupy. As I approached the center VIP booth, the three of them were completely oblivious to my presence. Richard was holding court, waving a silver oyster fork in the air as he told some ridiculous story about his days in the Senate. On his manicured finger sat a gold diamond ring that was undoubtedly paid for by my son's salary. Chloe was laughing, her head thrown back, her perfect hair catching the dim light. And Julian, my own flesh and blood, the boy I used to carry on my shoulders and built an empire for, sat there with a smug, relaxed smirk as he poured his father-in-law another glass of vintage champagne. I stopped exactly 2 feet from the edge of their table. I just stood there, letting my shadow fall directly across their spotless white linen tablecloth. Julian noticed me first. The smile froze on his face, and his eyes went wide, like he had just seen a ghost rise out of the floorboards. The crystal champagne flute in his hand tilted slightly, spilling a few drops of the expensive golden liquid onto his cuff. He gasped for air. Chloe followed his gaze. Her laughter cut off so abruptly, it sounded like she had been gagged. She stiffened, pressing her back hard against the leather booth, her eyes darting between me and her husband in absolute panic. Richard was the last one to realize the party was over. He lowered his oyster fork, his mouth still hanging half open, and the arrogant glint in his eyes was instantly replaced by a look of sheer terror. For 10 suffocating seconds, nobody spoke. The surrounding tables kept up their lively conversations, completely unaware of the silent storm that had just made landfall in this booth. Julian finally managed to squeeze out a breathless whisper. His voice was incredibly small, completely stripped of the bravado he had just been showing off. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and asked me what I was doing there. I kept my voice steady, calm, and completely devoid of warmth. I reminded him that today was the anniversary of his mother's passing. I told him I decided to treat myself to a good steak, and since he told me he was buried in Pentagon contract files at the office, I figured I had to eat alone. I asked him to imagine my surprise when I walked into the middle of this restaurant and found my hard-working vice president sitting right here. The lies rolled out of his mouth before his brain even had time to figure out how to stop them. It was the desperate, frantic lie of a cornered man. He begged me to wait, claiming things weren't what they looked like. He told me they were entertaining a client, that Richard had a friend who was a senior advisor on the Congressional Appropriations Committee. He swore Richard was just helping him pitch some preliminary proposals for the Nevada site, and that he was going to submit the whole business plan to me first thing in the morning. He swore to God they were working. I looked at the table. There were no blueprints. There were no legal notepads. There were no Department of Defense files. There was only a tower built out of cracked crab legs, empty lobster shells, and half-eaten caviar. I softly repeated the word working. Chloe tried to intervene, her voice dripping with a synthetic sweetness as she desperately tried to salvage the unsalvageable situation. She pleaded with me, calling me Arthur, saying they really didn't want to bother me on such a special day. She claimed Julian just wanted to handle the heavy lifting so I could relax. She told me to pull up a chair and let them buy me a drink to celebrate getting a preliminary letter of intent. I ignored her completely. My eyes locked onto the only piece of paper on the entire table. Resting on a small silver tray right next to Richard's plate was the itemized bill, even from 2 feet away. The bold number at the bottom of the receipt was impossible to miss, $3,500, and sitting squarely on top of that receipt, reflecting the dim light of the chandeliers, was a heavy matte black metal card, the Sterling Defense Group Corporate Executive Credit Card. My chest tightened violently, but not out of sadness. It was a visceral, deep-rooted rage that violently yanked me right back into the past. I stared at that black metal card, and suddenly, I wasn't standing in a luxury private club anymore. I was 28 years old again. It was a freezing November night in the 70s. I was sleeping in the cab of a beat-up Ford pickup in a muddy aviation scrapyard because I couldn't make rent and I couldn't make payroll for my 3 mechanics. I remembered waking up shivering, my hands cracked and bleeding from cutting titanium in the biting cold. I remembered washing my face in freezing gas station sinks before walking into bank after bank, begging loan officers to take a chance on my first military-grade aluminum project. I remembered skipping meals, sacrificing sleep, missing out on every simple comfort in life, and pouring every single drop of my sweat, blood, and soul into laying the foundation for a company that would bear my name. I endured a decade of brutal, back-breaking poverty just to make the Sterling Defense name carry weight, to make it command respect, and to ensure my family would never have to shiver in the dark. And now my son was using the fruits of my lifelong suffering to buy $3,000 seafood towers for a man who despised me, all while laughing about how clueless and old I was. I slowly reached out my hand. Julian and Chloe didn't dare move a muscle. Richard sat there with his breath caught in his throat. I picked up the heavy black corporate card from the silver tray. The cold metal felt incredibly heavy in my palm. I looked Julian dead in the eye. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quiet intimidation radiating from a man who knows exactly what kind of empire he built is far more terrifying than any screaming match. Julian's voice shook as he pleaded with me to take this outside, nervously pointing out that people were starting to stare. He was right. The deeply unnatural tension at our table had already started drawing the attention of the surrounding patrons. Nearby conversations had quieted down, and curious eyes were floating our way. I gripped the edges of the metal card tightly and told him softly that he was supposed to be reviewing defense contracts. I told him he was supposed to be protecting the legacy. I handed him on a silver platter. I snapped my hands together with force. The thick titanium card resisted for a fraction of a second before surrendering. With a sharp, loud crack, the metal snapped cleanly in half. Chloe gasped. Julian flinched backward. Richard went completely pale. I tossed the broken pieces of the card directly onto Richard's plate. I told them cheers, and looked at my son. I told him he was picking up his own check tonight. I turned around and walked out, leaving them sitting right there. I stepped out into the crisp night air as the heavy doors of the club slowly closed behind me. The neon city lights and the black asphalt blurred together as I drove back to my estate. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel, so hard my knuckles physically ached. But that physical discomfort was absolutely nothing compared to the ice-cold realization seeping deep into my bones. The adrenaline from the restaurant had already started to wear off, leaving behind nothing but a chilling, absolute, and purely logical clarity. I drove through the massive wrought iron gates of my property, the tires crunching loudly on the gravel driveway, before parking in front of the sprawling stone mansion. The house was pitch black. It was a monument to success, a fortress I built to protect my family from the cruel realities of the world tonight. It just felt unbelievably empty. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the grand foyer. My footsteps echoed off the marble tiles. I didn't turn on the main lights. I walked straight into my private study and closed the heavy oak doors behind me. I walked over to the mahogany liquor cabinet, picked up a crystal decanter, and poured myself 2 fingers of neat bourbon. I held the glass up to the moonlight spilling through the window, but I didn't take a sip. My brain was running at lightning speed, analyzing every single micro-expression I had just witnessed at that dinner table. Julian didn't just lie to me. He lied with a practiced, flawless ease that only belongs to someone who has done it 100 times before. The shock of snapping the corporate card was fading, and the analytical part of my brain, the part that had ruthlessly evaluated business acquisitions and opponents' weaknesses for 40 years, took completely over. I sat down in my high-backed chair and set the bourbon on the desk. This wasn't just about a missed anniversary. This wasn't even about the $3,500 blown on a single meal. Those were just symptoms. The real disease was the shocking level of entitlement I saw in their eyes. Richard feasting on my dime without a second thought, treating my son like his personal ATM, and Chloe mocking me, giggling while Julian called me an old fool who only cared about golf and had no idea what was happening in his own company. It was that specific piece of the puzzle that tied my stomach into a hard, unforgiving knot. Julian truly believed I was blind. He genuinely thought that because I had taken a step back to let him handle the daily operations of Sterling Defense Group, I had lost my edge. If he felt comfortable enough to casually swipe a high-limit corporate card to host a lavish family feast, knowing full well the finance department processes those receipts every Friday, it meant he was no longer afraid of oversight. It meant he had completely bypassed it. A man doesn't start off by stealing thousands of dollars in broad daylight. He always starts small. He tests the fences. It's only when he is absolutely certain the security alarms have been cut that he gets bold enough to throw a feast in the middle of downtown. I looked around my study. I looked at the framed blueprints of my first R&D center on the wall, and the scuffed yellow hard hat I kept on the shelf to remind me of exactly where I came from. I spent 40 years making sure no outside force could ever steal a single brick from my empire. And now, the thief didn't just have the keys to the front door. He was using them to pop champagne. I didn't sleep a single minute that night. I sat in the dark, watching the shadows stretch and shift across the Persian rug. As the early morning hours ticked by, I started tracing the trajectory of my son's recent behavior. I thought about his sudden, unscreened meetings with vendors. I thought about the times I asked to review the quarterly expense reports, only for Julian to brush me off, claiming he was still organizing the data to make the presentation clearer. I had been blindly giving him the benefit of the doubt. I let a father's pride completely override a CEO's survival instinct. I trained him to manage massive supply chains, negotiate complex defense leases, and oversee massive manufacturing budgets. I handed him immense financial power, assuming his moral compass was as solid as the steel beams holding up our corporate building. That assumption turned out to be the single biggest liability of my entire career. When the first rays of morning light broke over the horizon, painting the sky in pale shades of orange and gray, my grief as a father had completely burned away. The only thing left was a singular, unstoppable resolve. I stood up, stretching joints that had grown stiff from the long night, and walked over to my desk. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was exactly 6 in the morning. That was way too early for most people in the corporate world, but not for the man I desperately needed to call. I dialed Marcus Reynolds' direct cell number. Marcus was the senior legal director for Sterling Defense Group and a former high-ranking JAG officer. He possessed a cold, brilliant legal mind and had stood loyally by my side through the most brutal corporate dogfights of the late 90s. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and instantly on high alert. He knew that if I was calling him before dawn, the sky had to be falling. I didn't waste any time on pleasantries. I told him exactly what happened at the restaurant. I described the fake excuse, the champagne, the mockery, and the snapped corporate card. Marcus listened in absolute silence. When I finished, he let out a slow, measured breath. I told him I needed a completely unvarnished, panoramic view of my son's financial footprint inside the company. I instructed Marcus to completely bypass the internal finance department. I demanded a forensic-level shadow audit by an external team, covering every single transaction Julian had authorized over the past 24 months. I wanted him to pull and ruthlessly scrutinize every corporate credit card statement, every vendor invoice bearing his signature, and every expense report he had ever submitted. Marcus warned me that if Julian had an accomplice in the finance department, this kind of internal probe might trip an alarm. I told him to lock down server access under the guise of a routine security upgrade. Julian could not be allowed to catch a single whiff of this until all the paper evidence was resting in my hands. Marcus agreed, his tone turning deadly serious. He promised to have a preliminary report on my desk before noon. I hung up the phone and looked out the glass window. The massive city below was just starting to wake up, the streets filling with people rushing to their daily jobs. They had absolutely no idea that high above them, an empire was about to be purged. I slowly poured that glass of bourbon down the heavy brass sink. I no longer needed expensive alcohol to numb the lingering pain. What I needed was absolute, unwavering focus. The trap was now firmly, quietly, and permanently set. The morning sun crawled across the polished surface of my desk, casting long, sharp shadows that perfectly mirrored the ice in my chest. I had been sitting in my office since 6 o'clock, waiting for the inevitable performance. Julian arrived at 9:15. He knocked twice, a soft and hesitant sound, before pushing open the heavy oak door. He certainly looked the part. I had to hand it to him. He was wearing the exact same suit from last night, now slightly wrinkled, with his collar unbuttoned and his tie sitting loosely around his neck. His eyes were carefully guarded, carrying that manufactured heaviness of a man who supposedly just pulled an all-nighter with the local zoning board. He walked in holding 2 cups of black coffee and set one down right in front of me. He sighed, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and perfectly played the image of an exhausted son just trying to do his best. He told me good morning, his voice dripping with incredibly convincing fatigue. He said he brought my favorite drip roast from the corner shop, adding that he knew he was probably the last person I wanted to see right now. I looked at the coffee. It was a nice little trick. It was the perfect prop, used by a guilty conscience to buy forgiveness. I told him good morning, keeping my tone perfectly flat. I casually mentioned that I guessed those permit files took a lot longer than expected. He collapsed into the leather guest chair across from my desk and let out a long, heavy sigh. He told me he needed to apologize. He admitted he wasn't battling the Pentagon committee last night and said he was incredibly sorry for lying to me. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands in my lap, telling him to go on. He shook his head, wearing a look of pure, fabricated desperation. He blamed everything on Chloe. He said I knew how she got whenever Richard came to Washington. According to him, her father was being absolutely relentless, demanding they take him out for a nice meal, and completely hijacking the night. Julian claimed he told them it was his mother's anniversary and that he needed to be with me. But Richard threw a fit. He said Chloe threatened to take the kids to a hotel if he didn't keep the peace. He played the victim, saying he was backed into a corner and panicked. He claimed he knew telling me the truth would only hurt my feelings on such a special day, and he didn't want me feeling second best to his father-in-law. He painted his lie about the test site as a cowardly move, saying he hated himself for it. It was an absolute masterclass in manipulation. If I hadn't been standing in the shadows of that steakhouse, if I hadn't explicitly heard him call me a clueless, out of touch old fool, I honestly would have believed every single word he said. He painted himself as the tragic peacekeeper, a loving son caught between an unreasonable wife, a demanding father-in-law, and a father he only wanted to protect. He pushed the blame entirely onto everyone else in his life, dressing up his own deception as some twisted act of loyalty. I softly asked him about the corporate credit card, letting the question hang heavy in the air. Julian flushed, his eyes darting to the floor before meeting my gaze again. He called it another mistake. He claimed Richard ordered half the menu before he even sat down, and when the bill came, the number was just outrageous. He said he panicked again, claiming he didn't have that much liquid cash in his personal checking account at the time, so he used the company card. He swore he was going to reimburse the accounts payable department this morning before anyone even noticed. He promised me it was just a moment of weakness to get through a nightmare of an evening. I sat there, looking at the man I had raised with my own two hands. I saw the calculated remorse in his posture and the desperate hope in his eyes. He was hoping his trusting old father would just sweep this under the rug like always. He wanted absolution. He wanted a clean slate so he could go right back to his comfortable life of theft. I stood up, walked around my massive walnut desk, and stood right in front of him. He tensed up slightly, unsure of my next move. I placed a heavy, reassuring hand on his shoulder and gave it a firm squeeze. I forced a warmth into my voice that I had to dig deep into my soul to find. I told him he should have just been straight with me. I reminded him he was a grown man with a family to manage. And I acknowledged how difficult Richard could be. I said marriage is about compromise, and if he had to take them out to keep the peace. I understood that family dynamics were rarely simple. The relief that washed over his face was immediate and absolutely sickening. The tension completely melted out of his shoulders. He looked up at me with a grateful, boyish smile. It was the exact smile of a predator, realizing the trap hasn't been sprung yet. He visibly relaxed, leaning back in his chair, and thanked me. He said I had no idea what this meant to him, and admitted he thought I was going to explode. I kept playing the part of the benevolent patriarch flawlessly. I told him I was disappointed he felt he had to lie, but reminded him we had a business to run and a legacy to protect. I told him not to let it happen again, instructing him to reimburse finance by the end of the week so we could put the whole incident behind us. I suggested we honor his mother this weekend, just the two of us, and asked how that sounded. Hun eagerly agreed, promising there would be no more lies and swearing he would make me proud. I told him I knew he would, then told him to go wash up. I reminded him we had a board meeting to prep for, and that I needed my vice president at the top of his game. Julian stood up, buttoned his collar, and straightened his tie. His confidence was completely restored. He walked out of my office with a renewed spring in his step, entirely wrapped in the delusion that he had successfully manipulated the clueless old fool once again. I watched the heavy oak door click shut behind him. My smile vanished instantly. The warmth I had forced into my eyes evaporated, leaving nothing but cold, calculating focus. I walked back to my desk and picked up the coffee he had brought me. I walked over to the nearest potted plant and poured the black liquid directly into the dirt. I was absolutely not going to accept a peace offering bought with my own stolen money. Exactly 45 seconds after Julian's footsteps faded down the executive hallway, a soft chime echoed from the back of my office. It was the private executive elevator, a direct line up from the underground garage that only I and a very select few of my heavily vetted inner circle had clearance to use. Marcus Reynolds stepped into the room. He did not look like a man who had just enjoyed a relaxing morning. His tie was slightly crooked, his jaw was clenched shut, and his eyes carried the intense, heavy weight of a general preparing for war. In his arms, he carried a massive stack of bound bank statements, ledger printouts, and digital transaction logs. The stack was easily 6 inches thick, a mountain of financial data gathered in record time. He walked briskly across the room and dropped the entire stack dead center on my walnut desk. The paper hit the wood with a loud, heavy thud. Marcus completely stripped any emotion from his voice and told me he brought the shadow audit I requested. I looked down at the towering pile of documents, noting how fast he had pulled it off. I asked if his data extraction had tripped any internal system alarms. He loosened his tie and assured me it hadn't. He explained he used a backdoor protocol we established last year, meaning Julian and the finance department had absolutely no idea. We pulled these records. As far as the system was concerned, these files were never even accessed. I told him that was perfect. I explained I had just spoken with Julian, who fed me a sob story about his overbearing father-in-law and a moment of weakness. I told Marcus my son thought the problem was completely resolved. Marcus pulled up a chair to the desk and said we should let him keep thinking that. He warned me that this issue was vastly larger than a steak dinner. He said he had spent the last 3 hours analyzing Julian's corporate spending stream, and what he found was going to make me physically sick. He flat out stated it was worse than our most pessimistic worst-case scenario. I sat down directly across from him. I placed my hands flat on the desk, bracing myself for the brutal reality. I told Marcus to give it to me word for word and tell me exactly what my son was doing behind my back. Marcus opened the thickest folder. There was zero pity in his eyes. He looked at me with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon ready to make a deep cut. He slid a stapled document across the polished walnut. It was a summary spreadsheet, highlighting Julian's personally authorized payments over the last 12 months. I stared at the numbers. That $3,500 bill from the steakhouse, the spark that ignited this entire investigation, was listed at the very bottom, compared to everything else. That lavish dinner looked like pocket change. It was nothing but a rounding error in a massive sea of heavy withdrawals. Marcus tapped his pen against the spreadsheet. He said that dinner was just a symptom of a much larger disease. Over the past year, Julian had authorized exactly $1.2 million in independent strategic consulting and public relations fees. Every single one of those payments was funneled to an external vendor, a company called Apex Strategies. I picked up the spreadsheet. The name meant absolutely nothing to me. In the aerospace and defense contracting industry, you know who the major players are. You know the big military lobbying firms. And you know the heavyweight government relations consultants. I had spent 40 years personally cultivating relationships in the elite circles of this city. Apex Strategies was a ghost. It simply did not exist in my world. I demanded Marcus hand me the vendor file. He passed over a thick manila envelope, stuffed with invoices and a master service agreement. all bearing Julian's signature. I opened the folder and started reading. Building a multi-hundred-million-dollar defense empire does not happen by accident. It happens because you learn to read the fine print on every single contract. In my 30s, I couldn't afford high-priced corporate lawyers. I spent countless nights at a cheap kitchen table reading federal procurement regulations and Department of Defense contracts until my vision blurred. I knew exactly what a legitimate service agreement looked like. I knew the ironclad, specific language required to protect a defense contractor from liability. The documents in my hand were an absolute insult to my intelligence. The legal jargon was sloppy, amateurish, and purely boilerplate. It looked like something a college student copy-pasted from a free legal website. There were no specific performance metrics. There were no hard delivery dates. The scope of work was incredibly vague, using broad buzzwords like macro-political environmental consulting, preliminary policy conceptualization, and soft stakeholder interfacing. In the high-stakes world of defense contracting, you never pay over $1 million for soft interfacing before getting any actual approvals. You pay for hard congressional votes. You pay for legislation to get pushed through. You pay for concrete, undeniable deliverables. I flipped through the pages, deliberately lowering my voice to a dangerous level, and asked Marcus where the deliverables were. I said if we paid this firm over $1 million in a year, there had to be a mountain of briefing packets. There had to be digital analytics, physical mock-ups, or congressional relationship maps for our new defense projects. I demanded to know where the actual work was. Marcus leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. He said that was the most disturbing part. There was no work. He explained he got temporary access to Julian's digital project management drive and searched for anything related to Apex strategies. There were no memos. There were no analytics reports. There were no compliance reviews. He told me the only things that existed in this vendor file were these incredibly vague invoices, which Julian personally approved and rushed through our accounts payable department every single month. I set the papers down. The reality of the situation washed over me like a freezing, suffocating wave. My son wasn't just entitled. He wasn't just arrogant or lazy. He was actively and deliberately stealing from the company I built from the dirt. He was siphoning funds that belonged to Sterling Defense Group, funds meant to secure my employees' livelihoods and the future of our family's legacy. He had built a pipeline to drain my life's work. I stared at my son's sloppy signature at the bottom of a fraudulent invoice and asked Marcus if he tracked where the money went. I needed to know exactly who was receiving these wire transfers. Marcus let out a heavy sigh. He said he was still tracing the final destination of the funds, but he could confirm right now that Apex Strategies was a textbook shell company. It was incorporated in Delaware 14 months ago. There was no physical office address, just a registered agent and a P.O. box. There was no official website, and absolutely no other listed clients. He told me the company was created for the sole, exclusive purpose of billing Sterling Defense Group. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the silence of the office settle around us. The betrayal was so deep, it felt almost surreal. I thought back to the conversation I just had with Julian, the fake exhaustion, the calculated apology, the promise to make me proud. He had looked me right in the eye and promised to be a better son, knowing full well he had already bled my company for nearly $1.2 million. He thought he was untouchable. He believed his status as my sole heir granted him total immunity from the rules that governed the rest of the world. I opened my eyes and looked at Marcus. I said Julian thought I would never check. He assumed that because I handed him a vice president title and stepped back from the daily grind. The vault was left completely unguarded. Marcus nodded, saying Julian weaponized my trust. He called it the most common vulnerability in a family business. Perpetrators bank on the fact that parents will always give their kids the benefit of the doubt. They use your love as a weapon to blind you to the numbers. I stated firmly that he underestimated me. I said he forgot exactly how this company was built. I didn't survive the recession in the 90s by turning a blind eye to the numbers. I didn't crush a hostile takeover attempt in 2006 by ignoring the details. Every single dollar that flowed through Sterling Defense Group was paid for with my blood. Nobody, not even my own flesh and blood, was going to treat my life's work as a personal slush fund. I picked up the stack of invoices and tapped them against the walnut desk, aligning the edges perfectly. The anger inside me was no longer a hot, chaotic fire. It had hardened into something cold and incredibly sharp. It was the precise, surgical focus of a doctor preparing to amputate a diseased limb to save the rest of the body. I told Marcus I needed to know exactly who owned Apex Strategies. My voice resonated with absolute authority. I told him I didn't care how many layers of corporate veils they were hiding behind. I wanted full names. I wanted to know exactly who was profiting from this massive fraud today. I promised that once I had those names, we were going to start dismantling his life piece by piece until he had absolutely nothing left to steal from me. Marcus didn't hesitate. He reached into his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thin manila folder. He slid it across the walnut desk. The paper felt cold to the touch, a sharp contrast to the rage burning in my chest. I opened it and stared at a corporate registration document from the state of Delaware. The primary shareholder listed at the very top was Richard Winthrop. I looked up at Marcus. My face twisted in pure confusion. Richard Winthrop was a name I knew very well. Marcus anticipated my confusion. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together on the desk. He explained that Richard Winthrop wasn't some lobbyist, PR expert, or political consultant. He was my disgraced, former senator-in-law. More importantly, Marcus dropped his voice to a grim tone and added that Richard was using this shell company as a massive, secret slush fund for his political action committee to stage a comeback in Washington. The revelation hung heavy in the air as the puzzle pieces violently slammed together. My son wasn't just paying a fraudulent vendor. He was intentionally funneling millions of my dollars directly into his father-in-law's corrupt political machine. Marcus pulled out another sheet of paper detailing the flow of the stolen money. The cash didn't stay in Delaware. The second Sterling Defense paid for Apex Strategies' fake policy consulting. The funds were immediately wired into an offshore trust account. From that trust, the money was being used to fund an obscenely lavish lifestyle. Marcus read off the expenses with a cold, detached tone. There were charges for chartered private jets to the Amalfi Coast. There were bills for custom diamond jewelry, sports cars, and outrageous country club membership fees. Julian wasn't just a careless VP making administrative errors. He was a systematic thief. He was bleeding my legacy dry to bankroll his wife and her father's frivolous, corrupt existence. I leaned back in my chair, staring blindly at the registration document. For a brief second, a profound, fatherly grief washed over me. I remembered Julian as a little boy, running across the front lawn with a baseball glove, eager to make me proud. I wondered where that boy went and how he mutated into the greedy, entitled man sitting down the hall right now. But that grief was just a momentary weakness. It was quickly swallowed up by an overwhelming, completely uncompromising rage. I spent 40 years fighting off hostile takeovers, navigating market crashes, and crushing aggressive competitors. And I absolutely refused to let my own flesh and blood dismantle my empire from the inside. If Julian wanted to play the role of a corporate predator, I was going to treat him exactly like one. I picked up the brass telephone sitting on the corner of my walnut desk. My hand was dead steady. There wasn't a single tremble of hesitation. I looked at Marcus, my jaw set like stone. I told him we were ending this right now. I instructed him to immediately call his contacts at the FBI's Economic Crimes Unit. I wanted federal agents walking through the front doors of Sterling Defense Group within the hour. I wanted Julian handcuffed in the middle of the executive floor, paraded in front of all his colleagues, and shoved into the back of a federal cruiser. I wanted his assets frozen, his bank accounts seized, and a full criminal complaint drafted before the day was over. I declared him guilty of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy. I wanted him to face the absolute maximum penalty allowed by law. I wasn't going to protect him anymore. I was going to let the justice system crush him completely. Before my finger could even press the first number on the keypad, Marcus reached across the desk and slammed his hand down hard over the receiver. I looked up at him, my eyes narrowing with an intense, defensive anger. I demanded to know what he was doing. I told him to let go of the phone, but Marcus didn't budge. His expression remained incredibly cold, carrying a heavy, dark weight I had never seen in all our years working together. He gently pressed the receiver back onto the cradle, cutting off the dial tone. He told me to wait. He said that calling the federal authorities right now for simple corporate embezzlement would be a massive mistake. I stared at him in pure disbelief. I asked him how reporting such a massive scale of theft could possibly be a mistake. Marcus reached into his leather briefcase one more time. He didn't pull out another stack of bank statements or vendor invoices. Instead, he pulled out a standalone manila envelope that was sealed shut with very thick red tape. He placed it gently in front of me, setting it down like he was handling a live bomb. He explained that his cybersecurity team dug deep into Julian's private encrypted server late last night. They bypassed a highly sophisticated firewall, looking for more shell companies. But they found something else entirely, something that had absolutely nothing to do with aerospace lobbying or corporate finance. My heart started to pound in a steady, ominous rhythm against my ribs. I picked up the envelope, ripped through the red tape, and pulled out a single, encrypted digital file printed on heavy letterhead bearing a federal seal. Marcus locked his eyes on mine, dropping his voice to a quiet, grim whisper. He told me the embezzlement we found was horrifying, but it was essentially just operational funding for a vastly larger, incredibly sinister plan. I unfolded the paper and stared at the bold black text. It was a wire transfer confirmation, but the payee wasn't Apex Strategies, and it wasn't an offshore trust account in the Caribbean. It was a direct, local wire transfer for exactly $250,000. I looked at the payee line. It was a private, government-cleared security and medical facility located in a very exclusive, hidden neighborhood just outside of D.C. I read the payee's name out loud. Dr. Ellis Vance. A deep, suffocating confusion quickly swirled in my mind. I asked Marcus why in the world my son was wiring $250,000 in stolen funds to a psychological evaluation specialist who held a Department of Defense clearance. Was Julian sick? Was Chloe dealing with a hidden medical crisis? Marcus shook his head slowly. His eyes locked onto mine with a dark, unsettling certainty. He leaned across the desk, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it echoed like thunder in the quiet office. He told me Julian wasn't sick. He explained that they monitored the email traffic associated with that specific wire transfer. That $250,000 was not a legitimate medical consultation fee. It was a massive, untraceable bribe. Marcus pointed a steady finger at the doctor's name on the receipt. He told me that Julian, Chloe, and Richard were actively bribing a corrupt federal review officer to completely fabricate my personal health and security clearance records. It felt like all the oxygen had just been sucked out of the room. The implications slammed into me violently, making my senses reel. The embezzlement was just the surface. They were funding a political and medical conspiracy. The massive weight of Marcus's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I stared at the wire receipt, my eyes tracing the ink that spelled out the private psychological review specialist name. Dr. Ellis Vance. He wasn't just a regular doctor. He was a specialist who exclusively conducted psychological evaluations for officials holding top-secret national security clearances. Known for an incredibly tight lip and an exorbitant retainer fee. I had met him 3 years ago at a Pentagon charity gala. He was smooth, charming, and possessed eyes that evaluated everyone in the room like walking checkbooks. And now, my son was funneling $250,000 in stolen corporate funds directly into Dr. Vance's private account. I looked at Marcus across the walnut desk. The seasoned lawyer mirrored my grim expression. We both knew that a massive sum of money, secretly wired from a shell company to a federal review officer, especially when there were 0 corresponding medical appointments, on my schedule, was absolutely not a consulting fee. It was blood money. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling metropolis I had spent 40 years conquering. The glass and steel skyscrapers usually filled me with a deep sense of accomplishment. Today, they felt like the iron bars of a prison. I asked Marcus how we could actually prove their plan. Bank transfers look highly suspicious, but they are circumstantial evidence. Julian could easily claim he was paying for a friend's private medical consultation or investing in Dr. Vance's new clinic. We needed communication logs. We needed undeniable, ironclad proof of their intent. Marcus nodded slowly. He told me the standard corporate audit had hit a brick wall. To break through Julian's heavily encrypted personal servers and intercept the communications tied to the Apex Strategies payments, we needed to step entirely outside the boundaries of normal legal channels. We needed a shadow operator. At exactly 3 o'clock that afternoon, a man introduced only as Eli rode the private executive elevator up to my office. Eli was a former DoD cybersecurity analyst who now operated exclusively in the lucrative, morally gray world of corporate espionage. He didn't wear a suit. He carried a battered black backpack and had an incredibly unnerving, quiet demeanor. Marcus handed him the digital logs and IP addresses tied to Julian's hidden server network. Eli didn't ask a single question. He simply set up his encrypted laptop on my conference table, connected a complex series of routing devices, and went to work. The atmosphere in the office became impossibly tense. For 6 grueling hours, Marcus and I sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the city skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the room. The only sound was the rapid, rhythmic clicking of Eli's fingers flying across the keyboard. I poured myself a glass of water, my mind racing through 1,000 agonizing scenarios. I thought about Chloe playing the sweet, family-oriented daughter-in-law at every holiday dinner, smiling warmly while secretly plotting my absolute ruin. I thought about Richard sipping expensive champagne in the VIP booth at the club, bought with the very money he was using to destroy me. And I thought about Julian, my son, the boy I taught to ride a bike, the boy I proudly watched walk across the stage to get his college diploma. How did his soul become so completely corrupted? Did my wealth poison him? Or did Richard and Chloe just water the seeds of greed that were already planted deep inside him? At 9:15 in the evening, the rapid typing stopped. Eli leaned back in his chair and rubbed his exhausted eyes. He looked at Marcus, then turned his gaze to me. He announced he had successfully bypassed the secondary firewall and breached the encrypted email vault. Julian used to communicate with Richard and Dr. Vance. He extracted a local cache containing exactly 53 emails and 4 PDF attachments. Eli mirrored his laptop screen to the massive presentation monitor on the wall of my office. The digital evidence illuminated the dim room with a harsh, glaring white light. Marcus and I stepped closer to the screen, our eyes scanning the chronological list of emails. The subject lines were incredibly innocent, labeled as political risk consulting and family trust updates. But the actual content of the emails was devastating. Marcus opened the oldest email from 3 months ago. It was initiated by Richard. He was explicitly instructing Julian on how to approach Dr. Vance with the financial proposal. He wrote that Vance had a well-known gambling debt and desperately needed untraceable liquid cash. The subsequent emails detailed a chilling, meticulously calculated negotiation. Julian proposed a $250,000 down payment through the Apex Strategies shell company, promising an additional $750,000 the exact moment the final objective was achieved. Then Eli opened the first encrypted PDF attachment. It was a comprehensive federal security level medical file. My name, my date of birth, and my personal Department of Defense identification number were boldly printed across the top of the first page. I read the diagnostic summary in absolute horror. The document was a flawlessly fabricated psychiatric and neurological evaluation. According to the pages glowing on the screen, I had been suffering from a severe, progressively worsening cognitive decline for over a year. The report detailed fictional episodes of severe memory loss, aggressive behavioral outbursts, and a complete inability to manage complex national security secrets. Dr. Vance, leveraging his highly prestigious federal medical credentials, formally and legally diagnosed me with highly aggressive early-onset dementia. He falsified brain scan summaries, fabricated cognitive test scores, and stamped the document with his official federal medical seal, legally declaring me completely unfit to manage my own affairs, my company, or hold any defense clearances. The sheer malice of the conspiracy literally sucked the air right out of my lungs. The embezzlement was absolutely nothing compared to this. They didn't just want my money. They wanted to erase my autonomy. They wanted to strip me of my humanity and turn me into a helpless, medically condemned prisoner in my own life. Marcus scrolled down to the most recent email in the chain, dated just 2 days ago. It was from Chloe. She was confirming the final receipt of the fully executed medical and security demotion documents from Dr. Vance. Her message was short, cold, and dripping with a triumphant malice. She wrote to Julian and Richard, confirming the doctor had delivered the final paperwork. She stated the trap was perfectly set, and they had every reason to celebrate. The final piece of the puzzle violently snapped into place. The realization hit me like a freight train. I thought back to the steakhouse. I remembered the towering seafood platters, the laughter, and the sound of expensive crystal champagne flutes clinking together. They weren't celebrating some preliminary letter of intent for an appropriations committee. They were celebrating the successful completion of the forged medical and security review documents. They were celebrating the fact that they had just legally purchased my psychological death warrant. While I was sitting alone in my office, thinking my son was working late to protect our family's legacy, he was actually raising a glass to my impending destruction. He was laughing, drinking my champagne, and calling me a clueless old fool because he believed he had just successfully bought the power to lock me away forever. A profound, suffocating silence blanketed the office. Even Eli, a man who was used to the darkest corners of corporate betrayal, looked visibly disturbed by the pure cruelty displayed on the screen. Marcus placed a steady hand on my shoulder. He asked what I wanted to do. He told me we had more than enough evidence to send Department of Justice agents to their homes right now. We could have Julian, Chloe, Richard, and Dr. Vance arrested for criminal conspiracy, medical fraud, compromising national security, and grand theft before midnight. We could end this nightmare immediately with a single phone call. I stared at the fraudulent diagnosis bearing my name. The pain of the betrayal was immense, but the tears I expected to cry simply never came. Instead, the grief evaporated, leaving behind nothing but cold, terrifying, and absolute resolve. I wasn't going to call the authorities. Not yet. Having them arrested right now would be far too merciful. It would give them a quick out. They spent months digging a grave for me, and I was going to ensure, with absolute certainty, that they were the ones who fell into it. I stared at Marcus, my brain fighting to process the sheer weight of the evil currently sitting on my walnut desk. A medical conspiracy leveraging national security. My own son didn't just want to steal my money. Eli typed a few commands on his keyboard and pulled up a highly organized folder containing dozens of intercepted text messages and encrypted chats between Julian, Chloe, and Richard, displayed chronologically on the massive presentation. Marcus stood up and pointed to a conversation thread from 3 weeks ago. It was a group chat spearheaded by Richard. He was the one who initially proposed the legal mechanism. He had somehow discovered an incredibly obscure clause buried deep within the corporate bylaws of Sterling Defense Group. It was a clause I had personally drafted 30 years ago to protect the company in the event of a sudden, catastrophic health or security crisis. It was called the National Security Incapacitation Proxy. The clause stated that if the CEO was definitively diagnosed with a severe cognitive degenerative disease by a federally cleared medical specialist, rendering them a direct threat to defense contracts, the vice president could legally petition the board of directors for an immediate involuntary transfer of power. I read the messages in absolute disbelief. Julian replied to Richard with an eager enthusiasm. He wrote that the emergency shareholder meeting with the DoD liaisons was scheduled for next week. He explicitly stated this meeting would be the perfect stage to execute the coup. He planned to stand in front of the board and military representatives, play the heartbroken, dutiful son, and present this forged dementia diagnosis. He would claim my mind was rapidly deteriorating, that I was no longer fit to manage the $800 million defense empire I built from nothing, and that for my own good and the interest of national security, he needed to take total control. And he even drafted preliminary notes for the speech he planned to give, complete with fake emotional pauses and hollow expressions of a son's love. Chloe jumped into the chat next, her messages practically vibrating with unrestrained greed. She detailed her plans for how she was going to redecorate the executive suite once I was forcibly removed. She talked about liquidating my private stock portfolio and using the funds to buy a sprawling estate in the Hamptons. She even joked about how quickly they could rebrand the company to scrub my name off the letterhead. They were carving up the spoils of a war they thought they had already won. They were picking apart my legacy like vultures circling a dying animal. But the true horror of their blueprint wasn't the corporate takeover. Stealing the company was painful, but at the end of the day, it was just a financial loss. The absolute darkest part of their conspiracy was what they intended to physically do to me once the board stripped me of my power. I asked Eli to open the final thread of messages, a private exchange strictly between Richard and Julian regarding my subsequent living arrangements. My blood ran completely cold as I read Richard's instructions on the screen. He told Julian they couldn't simply force me into retirement and leave me in my own home. He warned Julian that I was far too connected and resourceful, and if left unsupervised, I would be incredibly dangerous. If I retained access to my personal lawyers, my private bank accounts, or my external government contacts, I might find a way to challenge the fake diagnosis and fight back. I might demand a second opinion. I might expose their entire operation. Richard had a permanent solution for that. He had a close personal contact in the Federal Health Department who ran a highly classified, government-cleared nursing facility in a remote suburb 3 hours north of the city. It was a facility specifically designed for a very small number of privileged patients suffering from severe dementia. It was a place where the doors locked from the outside. Visitation was strictly controlled, and contact with the outside world was heavily restricted for the patient's supposed safety. Richard wrote that the exact second the board voted to enact the proxy, Julian would automatically be granted full medical power of attorney over my life. He would have the absolute legal authority to commit me to that facility against my will. He could sign the papers, hire a private medical transport, and have me dragged out of my home in the middle of the night. They were going to lock me away and throw away the key. They planned to heavily sedate me, isolate me, and leave me to rot in a sterile room while they cannibalized the empire. I sacrificed my entire life to build. I read Julian's message confirming the plan. He wrote that the facility was expensive, but it was a small price to pay to ensure I could never interfere in their lives again. He literally referred to me as a security risk that needed to be permanently neutralized. The suffocating malice of the plan left me momentarily paralyzed in my chair. I realized that the dinner on the night of the anniversary wasn't just a celebration of successfully forging medical documents. It was a victory feast. They were celebrating the end of my life as a free man. They were raising a glass to my impending imprisonment, the woman I welcomed into my family, the politician-in-law I tolerated for years, and the son I raised from a boy were actively coordinating to erase me from society completely. Marcus looked at my face, his expression grim and professional. He asked if I needed to take a minute. He told me this kind of psychological trauma is too much for any man to process. I shook my head slowly, my eyes never leaving the digital text glowing on the monitor. I didn't need a minute. I needed every single word burned into my memory. I needed to remember the exact, precise depth of their betrayal, so that when the time for vengeance came, I wouldn't feel a single ounce of mercy. I stood up from the desk and walked over to the window again. The city lights flickered below, completely unaware of the monstrous betrayal playing out in my office. I thought about the decades I spent building my reputation. I thought about the countless late nights I sacrificed to ensure Julian had a comfortable life. I gave him the world, and in return, he was plotting to throw me in a cage. He wanted to strip away my wealth, my dignity, and my freedom, stealing everything I owned while destroying my legacy. I turned around slowly, looking at Marcus and Eli. The cold, absolute resolve that had taken root deep in my chest had now hardened into an unbreakable diamond. I was finally going to let them walk right into a trap of their own making. I turned away from the window and walked slowly back to my chair. The physical sensation in my chest was bizarre. I expected a devastating, heartbreaking heaviness. I expected the agonizing tears of a father who had permanently lost his only son. But my eyes were completely dry. The incredibly profound, suffocating betrayal had burned away every last trace of the soft, paternal instinct I had carefully maintained over the last few decades. In its place, an ancient, incredibly familiar coldness settled into my veins. It was the exact same icy detachment that kept me alive during the bloodiest corporate wars of my early career. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back to the early 90s. The intersection of Washington and Wall Street was a jungle fueled by unchecked ambition. It was a brutal, unforgiving gladiator arena where any perceived weakness was instantly and severely punished. I remembered the ruthless tycoons who tried to completely dismantle Sterling Defense Group before it even found its footing. I remembered men who were far smarter, wealthier, and vastly more dangerous than Julian. They aggressively tried to bleed me dry through hostile takeovers, aggressive short selling, and predatory litigation designed to ruin my life. I didn't survive by playing fair. I survived by becoming the absolute apex predator in the room. I learned to anticipate their attacks, lull them into a false sense of security, and completely dismantle their operations so they could never recover. For the past 15 years, I had been playing the role of the benevolent, semi-retired patriarch. I had filed down my sharp edges to keep peace in the family. Julian grew up protected under the shade of the massive tree I planted, completely ignorant of the sheer ruthlessness required to properly defend the soil. He mistook my generous nature for pathetic weakness. He mistook my advancing age for creeping senility. If my own flesh and blood truly wanted to play a cutthroat game of ultimate survival, I was absolutely not going to act like a wounded, helpless victim. I was going to show him exactly how a true, terrifying apex predator hunts. I opened my eyes and looked directly at Marcus. He was watching me with a complex mix of genuine concern and professional anticipation. He slowly reached into the pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out his encrypted cell phone. He clearly stated he was going to contact the lead DOJ agent for economic crimes right now. He promised me that with these forged medical files, the fraudulent consulting invoices, and the offshore wire records, federal authorities would easily have enough probable cause to raid Julian and Chloe's estate before dawn. He guaranteed me they would be sitting in federal holding cells by breakfast. I reached across the wide, polished walnut desk and clamped my hand firmly over his. The leather case of his phone was warm, but my grip carried absolutely zero heat. I told him to put the phone away immediately. Marcus frowned, a deep and highly visible confusion washing over his face. He reminded me that Julian and Richard were actively plotting a hostile coup in less than 7 days. He argued passionately that we had a very narrow window to strike first and legally secure my personal freedom. He insisted that, to properly protect the $800 million empire I built, we needed to move right now. I removed my hand, leaned back in my chair, and interlaced my fingers. I explained my reasoning with a slow, deliberate, and icy precision. I told Marcus that if we handed this irrefutable evidence over to federal authorities right now, Julian would undoubtedly use the very money he stole from me to hire the most expensive defense attorneys in the country. He would drag the complex legal proceedings out for years. At worst, he would only be convicted of white-collar fraud and corporate embezzlement. He might spend 3 or 4 easy years playing tennis and reading books in a minimum security federal facility. Chloe would immediately file for divorce, secure a massive settlement from his remaining hidden assets, and walk away effortlessly to her next wealthy target. Richard would loudly and completely distance himself, claiming to be an innocent victim of his son-in-law's horrific manipulation. They would ultimately survive the scandal. And for the people who actively conspired to steal my freedom and lock me inside a high-security psychiatric ward, a few years in a comfortable federal prison was far too merciful a punishment. I didn't just want the slow justice system to penalize them. I wanted them completely and systematically destroyed. I wanted to watch them lose every single ounce of luxury they took for granted. I wanted them bankrupted, utterly destitute, and desperately begging for a mercy they would never receive. I wanted the elite social circles they cherished to violently spit them out. I wanted their names to permanently become synonymous with absolute, humiliating failure, to achieve that exact level of total annihilation. We couldn't just react to their pathetic plan. We had to actively encourage it. I looked over at Eli, who was packing his decryption gear into his battered black backpack. I told him I needed to put him on an exclusive, highly paid retainer starting immediately. I instructed him to establish a continuous, undetectable surveillance feed on all of Julian's personal devices, Richard's encrypted channels, and Dr. Vance's private medical servers. I needed to know every single move they made, even before they made it. Then, I turned my attention back to Marcus. I told him we were going to initiate a completely different strategy. I called it the senile prey protocol. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, a cold curiosity flashing in his eyes. I explained the intricate mechanics of the trap. We were going to give Julian exactly what he wanted the most. We were going to make him believe his flawless deception was working perfectly. For the next 7 days, I was going to flawlessly play the role of the deteriorating, confused old man he described in that forged medical file. I would intentionally forget scheduled meetings. I would carelessly misplace vital financial documents. I would purposely exhibit brief lapses in judgment during casual conversations in the executive suite. We were going to feed his arrogant delusion, inflating his dangerous overconfidence to the absolute breaking point. We were going to make him feel like an invincible, conquering king, walking into that emergency congressional and board meeting next week. We were going to allow him to proudly present that forged dementia diagnosis to my colleagues. We were going to let him confidently invoke that national security proxy clause in front of the entire executive committee. I wanted him completely, legally, and highly publicly committed to his ultimate betrayal, because the higher he blindly climbed on that shaky pedestal of lies, the more devastating the impact would be when I finally shattered the foundation right out from under his feet. I was going to personally ensure that every single board member, every major investor, and every influential figure in this city witnessed his absolute, undeniable, and public ruin. The following Monday morning marked the beginning of my performance. I arrived in the executive suite exactly at 8, wearing a slightly oversized custom navy suit, a deliberate choice designed to make my frame look frail. My secretary, Sarah, a brilliant woman who had managed my schedule for 2 decades, greeted me with her usual warm smile. I stopped at her desk and stared blankly at the polished brass nameplate sitting next to her keyboard. I let a long, uncomfortable silence stretch between us, squinting my eyes as if I were struggling to grasp a distant memory. I asked her if she had seen the quarterly projections from the Chicago division, deliberately calling her Susan. Sarah blinked, a brief flash of confusion crossing her features, before she gently corrected me and handed over the files. It was a minor slip, entirely insignificant on its own, but in a highly pressurized ecosystem like Sterling Defense Group, rumors of vulnerability traveled faster than electric current. By noon, I knew Julian had already heard about my mental lapse. I spent the entire afternoon actively dismantling TC's own reputation for absolute precision. During a high-level strategy meeting with the regional directors, I sat at the head of the long glass table, staring at a projected revenue chart. When Julian stood up to present his meticulously crafted data for the next fiscal quarter, I interrupted him mid-sentence. I demanded he repeat the operational costs for a third time, pretending I was completely unable to follow his simple logic. I rubbed my temples, let out a heavy sigh, and muttered that the numbers just weren't making any sense to me today. I watched the other directors exchange nervous, fleeting glances. Julian, however, handled the interruption with a masterful, toxic grace. He walked over to my chair, placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, and repeated the figures slowly, using the exact kind of condescending tone usually reserved for a confused toddler. I nodded slowly, playing the part of an exhausted old man, grateful for his son's patience. The trap wasn't just about publicly showcasing cognitive decline. I needed to create an environment where Julian felt incredibly comfortable operating in the shadows, convinced I was too out of touch to catch his blatant theft. On Wednesday afternoon, I called him into my private office to discuss a routine defense vendor contract. Before he arrived, I walked over to the massive steel wall safe hidden behind an oil painting next to my desk. I spun the dial, pulled the heavy door open, and deliberately left it cracked, exposing stacks of highly classified legal documents and private ledger drives. When Julian knocked and entered, I was sitting at my desk, seemingly completely absorbed in an irrelevant yachting brochure. I watched his eyes dart immediately toward the exposed safe. I saw a greedy, predatory gleam light up his face for a fraction of a second before he quickly masked it with a polite smile. He sat down, and I handed him the contract, completely ignoring the massive security breach I had just personally created. For the rest of the week, I meticulously orchestrated a symphony of fake senility. I left highly sensitive emails concerning top-tier defense clearance projects open on my desktop monitor while I went to pour coffee. Knowing Julian would inevitably sneak in to snoop, I complained loudly to the finance department about missing funds that I had intentionally misplaced in a different account, only to humbly apologize for my foolish mistake an hour later. I even asked Julian to remind me of the name of our oldest defense contracting partner during casual hallway chatter. Every single mistake I made was precisely calculated, documented, and carefully fed into the exact narrative Julian was desperately trying to build. I was handing him all the ammunition he needed to convince the board that my mind was rapidly collapsing. Eli's continuous surveillance feeds confirmed my performance was working flawlessly. Late Thursday night, I sat in the dim light of my home study, reading the intercepted text messages flying between Julian and Chloe. They were absolutely euphoric. Julian sent long paragraphs detailing my supposed decline, bragging that the stress of the upcoming board meeting was causing my underlying condition to rapidly accelerate. He wrote that he barely even needed Dr. Vance's forged medical file anymore, considering I was doing such a fantastic job proving my own incompetence to the entire executive team. Chloe responded with a flurry of celebratory messages, gleefully stating that my pathetic performance was making their hostile takeover completely effortless. They were convinced my brain was collapsing under the weight of my own legacy, leaving the throne entirely unguarded. Their arrogance blinded them to the reality of the situation. By Friday, Julian had completely dropped his guard. Emboldened by my apparent deterioration, he began authorizing even larger wire transfers to Apex Strategies, pushing the invoices through with a reckless, sloppy speed. He stopped covering his digital tracks, assuming the clueless old man who cried over forgetting a name would never bother checking internal routing logs. I even took a private phone call with Richard right inside his office, a conversation easily intercepted by Eli. On the call, they openly discussed the exact timeline for transferring me to that government-cleared security facility. They laughed about how quickly they could pack up my personal belongings, convinced I would be far too confused to mount any meaningful resistance. I listened to that audio recording while pouring myself a glass of scotch. The pure cruelty in their joy was staggering, yet it only made the ice in my veins harden further. They truly thought they had won. They thought they successfully outsmarted the architect of Sterling Defense Group and reduced me to a helpless pawn in their grand scheme. But they failed to realize a fundamental rule of the corporate jungle. A true predator never reveals its strength until the exact moment of the kill. The weakness I projected was the ultimate weapon, a carefully woven web designed to let them tangle themselves to death in their own endless greed. As the weekend approached, the stage for the annual shareholder and defense liaison meeting was perfectly set. Board members and military representatives were flying in from across the country, their minds already primed by the subtle rumors of my failing health that Julian had so eagerly planted. The forged medical and security demotion files were printed and signed, ready to be presented as the definitive proof of my ruin. Julian had his tragic speech memorized, and Chloe was practically measuring the windows for drapes in my office. They were marching blindly toward the edge of a cliff, intoxicated by the illusion of absolute victory, and I was standing quietly in the shadows, holding a sledgehammer that was about to smash their world into a million jagged pieces. On Sunday evening, I reviewed my final preparations with Marcus and Eli. Every piece of our evidence was secured. Every countermeasure was firmly locked into place. I looked at the two trusted men sitting across from me, knowing that tomorrow morning would permanently change my family. Julian wanted to treat my business like a ruthless game. Tomorrow, he was finally going to learn exactly what happens when you corner an apex player on his own board. I was going to fall hard, and he was never going to recover. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, bitter chill, perfectly matching the exact atmosphere I needed in my private study. I arrived at the executive suite early to set the physical stage for the final act of this grand deception. I instructed Sarah to pull the velvet blinds shut in my office, plunging the room into dim shadows. I loosened my silk tie, unbuttoned my collar, and deliberately wrinkled my suit jacket to make my frame appear frail. I placed several generic orange prescription bottles on the corner of my walnut desk, positioning them where anyone sitting in the guest chair would immediately notice them. At exactly 10 o'clock, I pressed the intercom button and asked Sarah to summon the vice president. I forced a slight tremor into my voice, a subtle auditory cue of vulnerability. Julian arrived in less than 3 minutes. He knocked softly and pushed the door open, wearing a carefully practiced look of fabricated concern. He walked into the office, his eyes instantly locking onto the prescription bottles before scanning my disheveled appearance. A brief flash of predatory satisfaction crossed his features, though he quickly buried it under a mask of dutiful warmth. He approached the desk slowly, like he was approaching a wounded animal. He asked if I was feeling all right, noting that the office was unusually dark and that I looked incredibly exhausted. I sighed, pulling a long breath from deep in my lungs. I sank further into the leather chair, rubbing my temples with trembling fingers. I asked him to sit down, stating that we needed to have a very serious conversation about the immediate future of the company and our family. Julian sat down, leaning forward with an eagerness he couldn't quite hide. He was practically vibrating with anticipation, fully expecting me to hand over the crown. I looked at him with dull, glazed eyes, playing the tragic patriarch yielding to time. I told him I had a rough weekend, that I spent hours reviewing files only to find myself getting lost in the numbers. I confessed to him, with a precisely calculated tone of quiet desperation, that my memory was slipping at an alarming rate. I told him I was making mistakes, forgetting details, and that the sheer stress of managing the empire was becoming too heavy for my mind to carry. He told me it was natural, that I had worked hard enough, and that he was completely ready to carry that weight for me. I pulled my hands back, maintaining the illusion of the fragile old man. I told him I knew he was ready, and that was exactly why I called him into the office today. I pulled open my top drawer and retrieved a thick, professionally bound, hardcover portfolio. I slid it across the smooth wood toward him. I explained that it was a prospectus for acquiring a former Department of Defense satellite tracking station in Nevada. It was prime real estate, sitting on top of massive rare earth mineral deposits. The acquisition cost was exactly $20 million, and the projected return on investment over the next 5 years was absolutely astronomical. It was the exact kind of premium asset Sterling Defense Group would normally swallow without hesitation. But I told him I didn't want the company to hold this asset. I wanted him to have it. Julian stared at the glossy cover of the prospectus, his eyes widening in pure shock. He opened the file and began scanning the executive summary, his mind racing to process the sheer scale of the financial opportunity. I leaned forward, dropping my voice into a raspy, conspiratorial whisper. I told him my mind wasn't what it used to be. I explained that this $20 million facility deal was insanely profitable. I told him I wanted him to buy it under his own personal LLC. I promised that Sterling Defense Group would provide the capital guarantee. I told him to look at it as his early inheritance. Right before I officially retired, I watched his face carefully, tracking every single micro-expression as his greed violently collided with his logic. He was a thief, but he certainly wasn't a complete idiot. He asked me why I wanted him to purchase the property as an independent entity instead of folding it into our existing corporate portfolio. My answer was flawlessly prepared. I offered a sad, defeated smile. I told him it was because my cognitive abilities were failing. I admitted I was terrified of making a catastrophic mistake that could cripple the parent company. I explained that if he held the asset in a separate LLC, it would be shielded from any potential fallout caused by my mental decline. I assured him that Sterling Defense Group would act as the financial guarantor for the $20 million acquisition loan. I told him he didn't need to risk a single dime of his own money. He just needed to sign the purchase agreement as the owner of his new company, use our corporate backing to secure the funding, and reap the massive profits when the project launched. I packaged it perfectly as a father, desperately trying to protect his son's future before his own inevitable downfall. The bait was pure gold, and it was absolutely irresistible. I could see the greedy calculations spinning rapidly behind his eyes. In his twisted mind, he believed he was orchestrating the most lucrative week of his entire life. Not only was he planning to oust me from power and seize control of my $800 million empire at next week's meeting, but now I was handing him an independent $20 million asset on a silver platter. It was a staggering windfall, an unearned fortune that perfectly appealed to his parasitic nature. He could use this new company to funnel wealth to Chloe and Richard, completely outside the view of our standard corporate auditors. The temptation completely overpowered whatever tiny shred of caution he had left. Julian closed the portfolio, his face flushed with the greedy glow of absolute victory. He flashed me a sickeningly sweet smile and deeply thanked me for my immense generosity. He promised he would handle the acquisition perfectly, protect the asset, and make me incredibly proud of the man he had become. I nodded slowly, offering a weak smile, and told him to contact his attorneys immediately to begin the incorporation process for his new company. I instructed him to work with Marcus to draft the official letter of financial guarantee from Sterling Defense Group, assuring him my signature would be on the document before the end of the day. He stood up, clutching the heavy portfolio tightly to his chest like a stolen trophy. He practically floated out of the office, his steps light and energetic, utterly convinced he had successfully conquered my entire world. I watched the door click shut behind him. The exact second the latch caught, the fragile facade I carefully maintained instantly vanished. I sat up straight, fixed my tie, and smoothed out the lapels of my suit jacket. I reached across the desk and swept the generic prescription bottles directly into the trash can. The trap was now fully, permanently set. By accepting this deal and forming the independent company, Julian was legally tying himself to a massive financial obligation. He believed my guarantee would protect him completely. Having absolutely no idea, I was preparing to sever that exact lifeline at the most catastrophic possible moment. The golden carrot had been swallowed whole, and the heavy steel hook was now lodged deep in his throat, ensuring his absolute, undeniable destruction. Willai's surveillance network was a masterpiece of digital espionage. Less than 20 minutes after Julian walked out of my office, The encrypted audio feed on my private study monitor lit up. Julian was sitting in the back of his luxury black sedan, frantically dialing into a conference call with his wife and father-in-law. I leaned back in my chair, holding a glass of scotch, and listened to his breathless tone. He relayed our entire conversation, painting himself as an absolute mastermind who just successfully manipulated a dying old fool out of a $20 million golden ticket. He described my feigned confusion with cruel delight, mocking my trembling hands and my supposed inability to grasp basic corporate strategy. He told them about the Nevada facility deal, emphasizing my willingness to let him hold the asset in an independent LLC with Sterling Defense Group acting as the financial guarantor. Chloe squealed with delight, her shrill voice piercing the speakers. She instantly started calculating exactly how much the final profits would inflate their offshore accounts. But Richard was silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, calculating, and dripping with an insatiable, toxic greed. Richard told Julian to stop celebrating and start thinking like a true predator. He analyzed my offer with the paranoid mind of a seasoned con artist. He pointed out that if Sterling Defense Group acted as the official guarantor for the $20 million loan, the corporate board of directors would inevitably demand total oversight of the deal. They would mandate regular audits of the development, and they would unquestionably demand a massive cut of the final profits as a condition of bearing the financial risk. Richard argued that while my senility could be exploited, the other senior directors on the executive committee were still sharp and highly dangerous. He told Julian that involving the board in this transaction was a massive vulnerability. If any of the senior directors audited that independent company, they might uncover the Apex Strategies shell operation. They might discover the embezzled funds. Richard insisted they absolutely could not risk exposing their entire shadow operation just to secure corporate backing for this land grab. He declared they needed to completely cut Sterling Defense Group out of the equation. They needed to seize absolute control of the asset to guarantee they kept 100% of the astronomical profits for themselves. Julian hesitated, his natural cowardice briefly surfacing. He asked Richard how they could possibly secure a $20 million real estate and tech loan without the massive weight of Sterling Defense Group backing them up. Richard laughed a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed through my study. He told Julian he was thinking too small. He reminded Julian of the massive wealth they had already accumulated through the embezzlement scheme. More importantly, he reminded Julian about the obscenely lavish, fully paid-off Georgetown mansion I had purchased for him on his wedding day. Richard outlined his brilliantly disastrous strategy. He instructed Julian to immediately take out a massive, high-interest mortgage against his unencumbered mansion to secure the initial liquidity. Then, he told him to leverage Apex Strategies, since the shell company was receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent lobbying fees from my corporation every single month. It looked on paper like a highly successful, cash-rich enterprise. Richard proposed using their shell company as the primary cross-guarantor to secure the remaining balance of the $20 million acquisition loan. By combining the equity of the mansion with the fabricated financial strength of Apex Strategies, they could acquire the commercial funding completely independently. It was a breathtakingly reckless plan. It was the financial equivalent of building a skyscraper on a foundation of quicksand. If anything went wrong with that Nevada development, if the zoning permits failed, or the market shifted, they would be personally on the hook for a staggering, inescapable mountain of high-interest debt. They would lose the mansion, the shell company would be exposed, and they would be completely ruined. But their arrogance blinded them to the danger. They were absolutely intoxicated by the prospect of keeping $20 million of real estate equity completely hidden from my board of directors. Chloe cheered the idea, already planning how to spend the exclusive profits. Julian, ever the compliant and predictably greedy puppet, swallowed his father-in-law's horrific advice without a second thought. He praised Richard as a genius, entirely convinced they were outsmarting my supposed safeguards. And over the next 48 hours, Eli and Marcus monitored a frantic, reckless flurry of financial activity. Julian moved at a desperate pace, terrified that my fleeting moment of supposed generosity would vanish if my mind deteriorated any further. He contacted a predatory, private shadow lender, the kind that charged astronomical interest rates but asked very few questions. He rushed through a massive mortgage application, leveraging every single ounce of equity in his luxury home. Simultaneously, Richard finalized the paperwork to tie Apex Strategies as the corporate guarantor, submitting their forged bank statements as proof of financial solvency. They moved so fast, so completely blinded by the scent of unearned millions, that they didn't even bother reading the aggressive penalty clauses hidden in the fine print of the private loan agreements. By Friday morning, the trap was perfectly primed. Ali intercepted the digital transmission of the private lender's final purchase contract. I sat at my walnut desk, watching the live surveillance feed. Julian and Richard logged into the secure portal to execute the documents. They were sitting in Julian's home office, sipping expensive coffee, completely unaware that their every keystroke was being recorded. I watched the cursor move across the screen. I watched Julian apply his digital signature to the primary loan agreement, legally tethering his personal estate to the massive commercial debt. Moments later, Richard signed his name as the registered agent for Apex Strategies, officially binding the shell company to the cross guarantee. The digital stamps locked into place, sealing their fate with absolute, binding legal certainty. They had just, completely of their own free will, voluntarily chained themselves to a $20 million anvil. I leaned back slowly, an icy smile spreading across my face. The execution was absolutely flawless. They completely bypassed my corporate protections, choosing instead to risk their own stolen wealth and personal sanctuary. Driven by pure, undisguised greed, they thought they had successfully solidified their kingdom. They believed next week's joint meeting would be a mere formality, a simple coronation ceremony where they would lock up a senile old fool and inherit the earth. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already been completely hollowed out. I called Marcus and told him the signatures were confirmed. I instructed him to start preparing for the final phase of the operation on Monday morning. The incredibly long game was finally over. It was time to pull the lever and watch them fall straight into the abyss they built themselves. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, bitter chill, perfectly matching the atmosphere inside my private study. I asked Marcus to meet me at my house, well before the sun broke over the city skyline. We needed absolute privacy for this final briefing, far away from the corporate office and the probing eyes of my son. Marcus arrived exactly at 5 o'clock, carrying that familiar heavy leather briefcase. He looked exhausted, yet his eyes gleamed with a distinct, sharp flash of professional triumph. He sat down in the leather armchair across from my desk and accepted the black coffee I poured for him. He didn't speak immediately. He simply opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick, highly official-looking file bound in a striking red federal government folder. He placed it gently on the desk between us. Marcus announced it was done, his voice a low, steady rumble. He told me the county registrar officially processed the deeds at midnight, making Julian and Richard the sole, undisputed legal owners of that Nevada suburban commercial plot. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow sip of coffee. The liquid was piping hot, but I barely felt it. I asked him about the financial structure. Marcus confirmed it was executed exactly as they planned, completely driven by their own unrestrained greed. He explained Julian held the primary deed using his newly incorporated LLC. The acquisition was funded entirely through a high-interest private loan secured by leveraging his residential estate. He confirmed Apex Strategies, Richard's fraudulent shell company, was listed as the primary cross-guarantor. He stated Sterling Defense Group was legally and entirely severed from the entire transaction. They explicitly removed our corporate guarantee clause in a frantic rush to hoard non-existent profits. I nodded, letting a cold, grim satisfaction settle over me. I told Marcus to show me the environmental and security report. Marcus opened the red folder and slid a heavily redacted, highly classified federal document across the desk. It was a joint geological survey conducted by the United States Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency. To the untrained eye, or to arrogant amateurs like my son, that $20 million Nevada plot looked like an absolute goldmine. It was perfectly located near major transit arteries and rapidly expanding tech parks. On the surface, it was the perfect canvas for luxury commercial and high-tech R&D centers. But Julian was completely blinded by the golden carrot I dangled in front of him. He was far too eager to steal the prize before my supposed mind was gone to ever bother commissioning an independent soil and radiation analysis. He relied entirely on an outdated, superficial survey I deliberately planted in the portfolio, a survey that intentionally omitted the plot's deep history. Marcus tapped a specific paragraph on the federal document. He explained that during the Cold War, the property served as an unregistered radioactive isotope testing site for the Department of Energy. He stated that before modern environmental regulations existed, they dumped thousands of gallons of heavy metals, volatile organic compounds, and highly corrosive, radioactive industrial solvents directly into the ground. Decades ago, the facility was bulldozed and paved over in asphalt, hiding the poison deep in the soil. I stared at the chemical and radiation breakdown tables listed on the page and asked what its current federal status was. Marcus replied with a tight, grim smile, telling me that just 3 weeks ago, it was quietly designated as a federal Superfund Level 1 disaster site. He explained the federal government had issued a mandatory order for immediate, catastrophic environmental remediation protocols. The radioactive toxic plume had already started migrating toward the local water table. He declared the land completely unbuildable, highly toxic, and absolutely worthless. The pure brilliance of the trap hummed in my veins. A federal Superfund designation is the ultimate nightmare in commercial real estate and industrial development. It is a financial black hole. Federal law dictates that whoever holds the legal deed to the property is immediately and explicitly liable for the total cost of the government-mandated cleanup, regardless of whether they caused the initial contamination. I asked what the projected cost for the preliminary phase of the government-mandated environmental remediation was. Even though I already knew the answer, I just wanted to hear the numbers spoken out loud in the quiet study. Marcus stated with absolute conviction that it started at $20 million. He explained that was just the preliminary estimate to excavate and process the contaminated radioactive soil. It didn't include the ongoing federal fines, legal penalties, or the secondary groundwater purification protocols. And because the liability was federally mandated, it could not be discharged in a standard bankruptcy proceeding. I closed the red folder and ran my hand across the smooth paper. Julian thought he stole a $20 million asset. In reality, he had just voluntarily purchased a $20 million federal liability. He leveraged his beautiful, fully paid-off mansion to buy a plot of radioactive toxic wasteland, and by using Apex Strategies as the cross-guarantor, he legally tied the fraudulent shell company to a massive federal debt. I muttered that they wanted 100% of the profits, the irony tasting all sweet and sharp on my tongue. I said they didn't want to share a single dime with the Sterling Defense Board. So, they manipulated the paperwork, isolated their own company, and cut us out of the deal completely. I noted that in their frantic rush to rob me, they built an impenetrable legal wall that actually shielded my empire from the radioactive fallout. They took on absolutely all the risk. Marcus confirmed it entirely. He told me if I had forced Sterling Defense Group to guarantee that loan, our corporation would have been liable for the $20 million in cleanup costs. We would have faced an unrecoverable disaster. But by playing the part of a deteriorating, confused old man, I convinced Julian he needed to shield the asset from my supposed incompetence. Richard's greed did the rest of the heavy lifting. He manipulated Julian into using their stolen wealth to secure the property. He said they built their own financial prison, locked themselves inside, and handed me the only key. The sheer perfection of the poetic justice was staggering. Julian truly believed my brain was deteriorating. He thought my accidental slips and misplaced files were signs of highly aggressive, early-onset dementia. He never once considered that a man who spent 40 years navigating the most dangerous corporate waters in the world might be guiding him directly into a carefully laid ambush. He looked at the property prospectus and saw a shortcut to unimaginable wealth. He failed to realize that shortcut led straight off a cliff. I looked out the window as the first light of dawn began painting the sky a purplish gray, and asked what happens when the private lender realizes they accepted a highly toxic federal radioactive disaster site as collateral. Marcus explained, his tone completely devoid of pity, that the private lender would immediately call in the loan. He said they would seize Julian's residential estate by the end of the month. They would aggressively liquidate his personal bank accounts to cover the massive shortfall. Then, the federal government would come after Apex Strategies for the unpaid environmental cleanup costs. He told me that when federal auditors opened the books of Apex Strategies to seize their assets, they would immediately discover the embezzled funds. The agents would find the fake invoices, track the offshore wires sent to Richard and Chloe, and everything would be exposed in open court. I concluded that I was going to let him dig his own grave perfectly. The morning of the annual board and defense liaison meeting arrived with a heavy, overcast sky, casting a solemn gray light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling Defense Group executive boardroom. I arrived 45 minutes early, wearing a suit that looked slightly disheveled, a minor detail designed to reinforce the pathetic illusion I had carefully cultivated over the past week. I sat in my usual seat at the head of the massive, polished oak table, but I hunched my shoulders forward and let my gaze drift aimlessly toward the far wall. The senior directors and several military liaisons began filtering into the room just after 9 o'clock. These were men and women I had known for decades, ruthless financial titans, brilliant legal minds, and aggressive top brass who had helped me build this empire from the ground up. As they took their respective seats, I could feel their eyes sweeping over me with a mix of quiet pity and sharp, predatory calculation. The rumors Julian had meticulously planted had clearly taken root in their minds. Julian entered the room exactly on time, flanked by his private legal team, looking with every inch the conquering heir. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit and a carefully calibrated expression of solemn responsibility on his face. He paused briefly by my chair, placed a firm, condescending hand on my shoulder, and asked in a voice just loud enough for the nearest directors to hear if I felt up to the stress of the meeting today. I didn't look up at him. I offered a slow nod and kept my hands folded on the table to hide the fact that they were absolutely rock steady. Julian took his seat at the opposite end of the long table, the traditional position for the executive vice president. The room settled into a heavy, expectant silence. The initial agenda items were handled with a rapid, almost perfunctory efficiency. The quarterly financials were approved. Standard legal disclosures were confirmed. Routine defense contract progress was filed. Everyone in the room knew this gathering was absolutely not about standard corporate housekeeping. The air was thick with the undeniable, electric static of an impending execution. I sat quietly through the mundane proceedings, occasionally asking a slightly confused question or mispronouncing a familiar military term, adding the final, necessary strokes to the masterpiece of my perceived decline. At exactly 10:30, the time scheduled for new executive business, Julian stood up from his chair. The entire room went dead silent. He didn't start speaking immediately. Instead, he took a slow, deep breath, perfectly mimicking the heavy burden of a man about to perform a terrible but necessary duty. He looked down at the polished wood table, letting a long, dramatic pause stretch through the quiet room. When he finally looked up, his eyes gleamed with a carefully manufactured moisture. He had clearly spent hours practicing this heartbreakingly sincere look in the mirror of his fully paid-for mansion. He began by speaking about the incredible legacy of Sterling Defense Group. He spoke eloquently about my decades of relentless dedication, my brilliant strategic vision, and my supposed sacrifices to build the company into an $800 million powerhouse. His voice was steady, carrying weight, and layered with a sickeningly sweet tone of filial reverence. He told the board that to him, I wasn't just a CEO, I was a personal hero, a mentor, and a deeply loved father. He painted a picture of our family bond that was so thick with fabricated emotion, I almost felt a genuine wave of nausea rise in my throat. Then the pitch of his voice changed. The reverence gave way to a heavy, trembling sadness. He announced to the quiet room that sometimes the greatest act of love a son can perform is admitting when his hero can no longer fight his own battles. He stated that over the past 6 months, he and the family had noticed a severe and heartbreaking decline in my cognitive abilities. He described my intentional memory lapses, my faked confusion over basic financial and contract documents, and my supposed inability to track simple corporate strategies. He looked around the room, making direct, mournful eye contact with the most influential directors and military representatives, assuring them he had tried his absolute hardest to hide my deteriorating condition to protect my dignity. But he could no longer conceal the truth. Julian reached into his custom leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope, with a sharp, dramatic tearing sound that echoed in the quiet boardroom. He broke the seal. He slid the documents out and placed them on the table. It was the fraudulent medical and national security risk assessment file, compiled by Richard's corrupt associate, Dr. Vance. Julian announced that he recently convinced me to undergo a comprehensive, independent military-grade neuropsychological evaluation, he claimed, his voice cracking with a perfectly timed catch, that the results were absolutely devastating. He instructed his legal counsel to distribute certified copies of the medical and security review files to every single board member sitting at the table. I watched quietly as the thick stacks of forged documents were passed down the line. The directors opened the files, their eyes scanning the dense medical jargon, the fabricated brain scan analyses, and the absolute, fraudulent diagnosis of highly aggressive early-onset Alzheimer's, paired with a security clearance demotion. I could hear the rustle of turning pages and the low, concerned murmurs rippling through the room. Julian let the devastating information settle in their minds for a few minutes before speaking again. He wiped away a single, fake tear from his cheek and squared his shoulders. He declared that the medical and security evaluation evidence was undeniable, and that my condition had deteriorated far beyond management. He argued with passionate, aggressive logic that Sterling Defense Group and its associated defense contracts simply could not survive with a mentally compromised man at the helm. He stated that the current global volatility demanded sharp, decisive leadership, which the medical report definitively proved I was no longer capable of providing. He perfectly played the role of the dutiful corporate protector, insisting he wasn't seeking power for himself, but stepping up to save his father's brilliant legacy from ruin and to protect national security. He reminded the board of the specific obscure clause, hidden deep within our corporate bylaws, the National Security Incapacitation Proxy. He stated the foundational documents explicitly dictated that, in the event of a severe, medically certified cognitive decline that could result in a major security breach, the board had a fiduciary duty to immediately execute an involuntary transfer of executive power to the sitting vice president. He looked directly at me, and despite the sorrow in his tone, his eyes were completely devoid of warmth. He told the board it was time to let the old lion rest. With a final, heavy sigh, Julian formally submitted the forged medical file into the official corporate record. Then, he made his final, fatal move, playing the part of a deeply concerned, loving son forced to do what was necessary for his sick father. He formally requested an immediate, binding vote. He asked the board to enact the proxy, permanently strip me of all corporate authority, and transfer absolute, undisputed executive power of Sterling Defense Group directly to him. The trap had finally been fully triggered for everyone to see clearly. A heavy silence settled over the boardroom, like fog after his dramatic plea. The directors shifted their gazes toward me, their expressions a mix of pity and hesitation. They were waiting for my reaction, expecting a confused outburst from a man whose mind was slipping away. Julian remained standing at the opposite end of the glass table, holding his posture as the heartbroken son performing a terrible duty. He looked me in the eye, hiding a silent challenge beneath his fabricated sorrow. I didn't yell, and I didn't pound my fists on the table. Instead, I leaned back slowly in my leather chair and let out a soft chuckle that sent a ripple of absolute confusion through the entire room. That chuckle grew into a genuine, relaxed smile. I reached under the lip of my desk and pressed a concealed silver button. Instantly, the double doors at the back of the boardroom were pushed open with a loud bang that shattered the tension in the room. Every head at the table snapped around in alarm. Julian flinched, his perfectly crafted mask slipping as he stared at the entrance. Marcus stepped into the room, walking with a steady pace that radiated absolute authority. My trusted legal counsel was not alone. The men flanking him instantly shifted the atmosphere from a corporate dispute to a criminal investigation. They were two tall men wearing dark suits, their badges clearly identifying them as special agents from the FBI's Economic Crimes Unit. Trailing nervously behind them, looking like he was about to collapse at any second, was a man the board had never seen before, but whose name was printed on every single medical security file sitting right in front of them. It was Dr. Ellis Vance, the corrupt government psychological review officer Richard hired to fake my cognitive decline assessment. He looked absolutely pathetic. His face was pale and covered in a nervous sweat. He clutched a leather folder tightly to his chest like a shield, his eyes darting frantically around the room before fixing firmly on the floor. He refused to look up. A confused murmur erupted among the directors. The chairman of the board stood up, demanding to know the meaning of this interruption. I raised my hand, silencing the room with a simple, authoritative gesture I hadn't used in weeks. The sudden clarity and absolute command in my voice caused several directors to blink in pure surprise. I spoke calmly to the room, thanking Julian for his deeply moving, albeit entirely fictional, performance. I watched the color drain from my son's face. The flush of victory instantly vanished, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. I pointed to the trembling doctor in the doorway. I informed the board that before they cast a single vote regarding my competency, they needed to hear from the man who supposedly diagnosed me. Marcus stepped forward officially and introduced the federal agents and Dr. Vance. He explained that Dr. Vance was present under a specific, federally mandated plea agreement. Authorities had intercepted communication logs proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the medical and security demotion file on the table was a complete forgery. Vance had accepted a massive bribe from Apex Strategies to falsify federal medical and security records. This was a severe felony that threatened both his license and his freedom. To avoid the maximum sentence, the doctor agreed to wear a wire during his final meeting with Richard, providing full, recorded testimony of the entire conspiracy. Shocked chaos erupted in the boardroom. The directors frantically flipped through the fraudulent medical files. Julian froze at the end of the table, his mouth opening and closing without making a single sound. The illusion of the dutiful, loving son shattered instantly, exposing the terrified, cornered thief hiding underneath. One of the federal agents stepped forward. His voice cut through the noise with a flat, professional monotone. He addressed the board and military liaisons directly, stating that the DOJ and FBI had been monitoring a massive money laundering and corporate embezzlement ring operating right out of my son's office. He explained that millions of dollars had been siphoned from Sterling Defense Group under the guise of fake consulting fees and funneled directly into offshore accounts controlled by Julian and his father-in-law. The agent turned his gaze to Julian, whose knuckles had turned completely white from gripping the edge of the table so hard. He announced that the Economic Crimes Unit had just executed coordinated raids on the primary offices of Apex Strategies and Julian's residential estate. He detailed the unbelievable financial trap Julian had blindly walked into just 3 days ago. He explained to the horrified board of directors that the vice president had used the embezzled funds and his personal mansion to secure a $20 million commercial loan for a property he thought would make him independently wealthy. Marcus took over, delivering the final, devastating blow with surgical precision. He projected the federal DOE and EPA environmental report onto the massive display at the front of the room. He explained to the bewildered executives that the property Julian purchased was a federally designated, highly toxic radioactive waste site. He detailed the Superfund status, the massive chemical and radiation contamination, and the unyielding to federal legal liabilities that came attached to the deed. Marcus made it crystal clear that because Julian acted entirely out of greed, secretly hiding the transaction through his personal company and using Apex Strategies as the cross-guarantor, Sterling Defense Group was completely shielded from this massive federal cleanup debt. I sat quietly in my chair and watched my son absorb the full consequences of his ruin. His knees gave out slightly, and he collapsed heavily back into his seat, his eyes wide with terror and disbelief. In that agonizing moment, he realized that every single step he took over the past month had been meticulously anticipated and orchestrated by the exact man he thought he was outsmarting. The senile old fool he mocked behind closed doors had flawlessly manipulated him into taking on a massive, inescapable radioactive debt while sending him straight to federal prison. The second federal agent walked slowly down the length of the long glass table. A heavy silence fell over the room again, broken only by the crisp, rhythmic sound of the agent's footsteps. He stopped directly behind Julian's chair. He calmly asked my son to stand up and place his hands behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the executive boardroom was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The board members watched in absolute, paralyzed shock as the vice president of Sterling Defense Group was formally arrested for corporate espionage, compromising national security, grand embezzlement, and federal wire fraud. I stood up from my chair and felt a sudden weight lift off my shoulders. That custom suit no longer felt too big. My posture was absolutely straight, and my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. I looked down at my son, who was crying pathetic tears as the agents pulled him away from the table. There was absolutely no mercy left in my heart, only the cold, satisfying result of a decisive victory. I turned my attention back to the silent, staring executives. I calmly adjusted my tie, pressed my hands firmly onto the polished wood table, and informed them that the executive vice president had been officially terminated. It was time to get back to the actual business of running my company. The heavy, solid oak doors of the boardroom remained open, framing the hallway where the rest of the executive staff had gathered in stunned silence. I shifted my gaze back to Julian, who was still slumped near his chair, shaking uncontrollably as the federal agents stood behind him. I took a deep breath, letting the full weight of my authority fill the massive room. My voice, which had been a fragile whisper just moments ago, now boomed with the absolute power of a man who built an empire from nothing. I told him that the medical report was a pathetic fake, a desperate illusion cooked up by cowards who didn't have the brains to build their own legacy. But that $20 million toxic radioactive debt he so eagerly signed his name to yesterday. That was very real. I watched the realization wash over his pale face. He had mortgaged his entire life for a piece of radiation-poisoned wasteland. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of frantic footsteps coming from the marble hallway outside. Suddenly, the boardroom doors were pushed open even wider. Richard and Chloe burst into the room, their faces flushed with arrogant victory. Chloe was actually holding a chilled bottle of imported champagne, and Richard was gripping a set of crystal flutes. They had been waiting in the executive lobby, fully expecting Julian to text them the exact second the board voted to strip me of my power. They came to celebrate my demise, ready to pop the cork on the grave of my career. The exact second they've crossed the threshold, they froze. The champagne bottle slipped from Chloe's manicured hands and smashed against the polished hardwood floor. The expensive liquid pooled around her designer shoes, a perfect metaphor for their shattered dreams. They stared into absolute horror at the federal agents standing firmly behind Julian, and then at Dr. Vance, who was weeping silently in the corner. Richard's eyes darted frantically around the room, desperately looking for an explanation that didn't end in his own ruin. He looked at the board members, who stared back at him with undisguised disgust. He looked at Julian, expecting to find his arrogant puppet, only to see a broken, crying child. Finally, his eyes met mine. I offered him absolutely zero pity. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of financial documents. I slammed those heavy folders onto the glass table, the sound cracking like a gunshot. I told Richard that those files contained every single fraudulent invoice, every hidden offshore wire transfer, and every piece of damning evidence regarding Apex strategies. I explained to the room that over the past year, this former politician and his daughter had actively conspired with my son to embezzle $1.2 million from Sterling Defense Group. Chloe let out a sharp, hysterical gasp and slapped a hand over her mouth. Richard took a step back, shaking his head frantically in denial, insisting this was all a terrible misunderstanding and that Julian forced them into it. I ignored his pathetic lies. I looked directly at Julian and delivered the final, crushing blow. I told him that the predatory private bank had already been notified about the fraudulent cross-guarantee they used to secure the commercial land loan, because they intentionally falsified the financial stability of Apex Strategies. The bank triggered an immediate default clause. I told him with cold precision that his luxury estate had been officially foreclosed on and seized this morning. They were completely homeless. Furthermore, the federal government was already preparing to seize every remaining asset they owned to pay the $20 million environmental remediation fine for the highly toxic radioactive site. They were held absolutely, personally liable. The sheer magnitude of their destruction finally hit them with the force of a collapsing building. Julian slipped from his leather chair and fell heavily to his knees on the boardroom floor. The arrogant crown prince, the man who confidently planned to lock me inside a maximum security psychiatric ward, was now crawling toward my shoes. He held out his shaking hands, begging through agonizing sobs. He begged me to reverse the deal. He begged me to use the massive wealth of Sterling Defense Group to pay the federal fines, to save his home, to save his wife. He screamed that I was his father and that I had to protect him because he was family. I looked down at him with an incredibly deep detachment, feeling like I was observing a total stranger. I told him that the exact second he conspired to erase my existence and lock me in an asylum, He surrendered the right to call me family. Richard began letting out raw, unfiltered screams of panic. He shrieked that he was a respected member of society, that he was a politician, that he couldn't go to prison, and that his reputation would be ruined. One of the federal agents stepped forward calmly and produced a second arrest warrant with Richard's name on it. He informed the former senator that the Department of Justice didn't care about his social status, only about the $1.2 million he actively helped steal from my company and the treasonous charges regarding the falsified federal security clearance documents. Chloe leaned back against the wall and slid down to the floor. She realized that her endless life of luxury was permanently over. She had absolutely nothing left except the memory of the wealth she had tried so greedily to steal. The boardroom remained dead silent, as every director watched the spectacular collapse of the conspiracy. I stepped away from Julian, making sure my polished leather shoes remained completely spotless. I looked down at the three of them. They were a pathetic, tangled mess of completely shattered ambition and fully exposed, vicious betrayal. My mind naturally drifted back to the dinner on the night of the anniversary, the exact night this entire nightmare truly began. I remembered sitting at the head of my family table, surrounded by people I supported and loved, only to feel an invisible wall of deception rising between us. I vividly recalled those cold, dismissive, and arrogant looks they secretly exchanged when they foolishly thought I wasn't watching. I remembered how they rushed through the celebration, eager to get back to their plotting, treating my wife's memorial as nothing more than a tedious obligation. I focused my gaze on Julian, who was still weeping into the hardwood floor. My voice was quiet, yet it carried clearly to every corner of the massive room, sharp and completely unforgiving. I told him that on that deeply sad anniversary in my life, they were all far too busy to simply sit down and share a meal with me. I reminded him of their rush, their fake emergencies, and their incredibly profound disrespect. I paused deliberately for a moment, letting the freezing reality of my final words sink fully into his terrified brain. I told him he would never have to worry about rushing through a meal ever again. I assured him that now he, Chloe, and Richard would have years of completely free time to sit quietly and eat cafeteria food inside a federal prison cell. I gave a slight nod to the federal agents. The heavily armed agents immediately stepped forward in unison. The heavy metallic clicks of handcuffs echoed through the quiet room, permanently sealing their total. Absolute ruin. Chloe watched in absolute horror as the federal agents escorted her crying husband and screaming father out of the executive boardroom. She had miraculously managed to keep her signature off the official purchase documents and the fraudulent corporate shell accounts, shielding herself from immediate federal indictment. However, that legal insulation provided her absolutely no real protection against the crushing reality of her new situation. The bank had foreclosed on her magnificent estate at dawn. The federal government had frozen their joint bank accounts to secure initial collateral for the $20 million radioactive waste cleanup. She was left completely and utterly destitute. I stood quietly at the head of the glass table and watched as my private security team politely but firmly escorted her out of the corporate building. She left with absolutely nothing except the designer clothes on her back. The boardroom slowly emptied out, leaving just me and Marcus standing alone. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the bustling city streets below. I watched the sleek federal cruisers turn on their flashing lights and pull away from the curb, carrying the wreckage of my treacherous family straight toward their ultimate ruin. I felt a profound peace settle over the room, a deep, dead silence that I hadn't experienced in over a year. I shifted my gaze from the glass and looked directly at Marcus, who was efficiently gathering the remaining legal documents into his leather briefcase. I instructed him to draft the necessary paperwork to permanently and irrevocably strip Julian of his right to inherit anything from my estate. I told him to completely restructure my personal will and the foundational corporate bylaws of Sterling Defense Group. I wanted to redistribute my massive shares directly to the loyal, long-term employees who actually bled and sacrificed to help me build this empire from nothing. Furthermore, I instructed Marcus to establish a massive, independently managed scholarship foundation. I wanted to dedicate a significant portion of my wealth specifically to funding young engineers from working-class backgrounds who possess genuine ambition rather than inherited privilege. Marcus nodded with deep professional respect, confirming that the new legal directives would be executed flawlessly by the end of the week. I walked back to my desk, pulled open the bottom drawer, and retrieved a heavy crystal decanter filled with aged, incredibly expensive Kentucky bourbon. I poured a generous measure into a thick rocks glass, the amber liquid catching the soft light filtering through the overcast sky. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the familiar warmth burn through my chest. I was a 68-year-old man, absolutely alone, standing in a massive corporate fortress. I had just permanently lost my only son to an incurable disease called greed. A weak man might have broken under the crushing weight of this heartbreaking reality. A weak man might have cried for the shattered illusion of a loving family. However, as I stood there, staring out at the breathtaking city skyline I conquered decades ago, I didn't feel a single ounce of sadness. I didn't feel any lingering grief or parental regret. I had surgically excised a spreading, malignant tumor from my life before it could completely consume my hard-earned legacy. I protected my beloved, sprawling empire, and I reclaimed absolute, undeniable sovereignty over my own existence. The air in my office finally felt clean, crisp, and entirely breathable. I took another slow sip of the smooth bourbon, savoring the exquisite taste of absolute victory. My massive legacy was finally completely secure, perfectly insulated from the treacherous leeches who had desperately tried to bleed it dry. I knew there would be countless loud whispers echoing through the bustling financial districts and Pentagon hallways in the days to come. But those ignorant whispers meant absolutely nothing to me now. I survived the worst betrayal imaginable, and I emerged proudly sharper, infinitely stronger, and completely victorious against all terrible odds. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and family is never an excuse to tolerate betrayal. We spend our entire lives making sacrifices to raise our children, hoping they will inherit our morals right alongside our wealth. But when greed poisons their hearts, you must have the courage to stop being their safety net. True love sometimes means letting them fall into the terrible consequences of their own destructive actions. Protect your peace of mind, defend your hard-earned legacy, and never let anyone, regardless of who they are, mistake your generosity for foolish vulnerability. You owe yourself the respect they refuse to give you. If this story proves that karma always comes back to collect its massive debts, please hit that like button to show your support.